Hey everyone! Welcome back or welcome for the first time to this quiet late night journey into very old problems. If you're listening in bed, good. If the lights are dimmed and your brain is tired but refuses to shut up, even better. Tonight, we're not talking about kings wrapped in gold leaf or queens whose eyeliner could probably slice through a limestone block. No Tut, no Cleopatra, no Ramesses flexing with another temple inscription. Instead, we float downward, down past the palaces and monuments, down to the mud-brick houses that rarely make it into textbooks. Tonight, we settle beside the Nile, where the people who didn't have names recorded in hieroglyphs lived, ate, and complained about taxes. Yes, taxes existed, because of course they did. So settle in, close your eyes if you want, and let's drift back 4,000 years to see how the majority of ancient Egyptians actually lived. Not the crown wearers, not the tomb builders' bosses, just the ordinary people who woke up early, worked all day, and probably wondered why the pharaoh needed another pyramid. Let's start with where they lived. Most Egyptians were farmers, not glamorous unless you consider fresh mud as interior decor. Their houses were made of mud brick, sun-dried clay mixed with straw, basically the same material you used in kindergarten crafts, except theirs had to survive blistering heat, floods, and in-laws dropping by unannounced. The walls were thick to keep the heat out. No glass windows, just small openings that let in tiny slices of air and sometimes sand. Sand everywhere, forever. Inside, the house layout was extremely simple. A main room, maybe a roof you could sleep on when nights got too hot. Floors made of packed earth. Furniture was optional. Beds uncommon. Mats on the floor were more realistic. It wasn't minimalist decor, it was literal minimalism. Imagine waking up before sunrise, in the dark, lying on a woven mat. Maybe a jar of beer brewing somewhere nearby. Maybe grains stored in a clay pot. Maybe a goat outside making regrettable sounds. And right outside your door, the Nile, because everything depended on that river. Each year it rose, flooded the surrounding land, and left behind fertile silt. This silent, muddy gift determined whether you ate well or starved. So for the average Egyptian, hydrology was more important than royal drama. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was the calendar, the pantry, the employer, and the highway. Speaking of calendars, they didn't measure time the way we do. Instead, the year was divided into 3 simple seasons: flooding, growing, and harvest. That's it. No winter depression sales, no pumpkin spice, just mud, crops, and more crops. During flood season, farmers turned into laborers. They were summoned for corvée labor, basically mandatory public service. Work gangs built irrigation canals, temples, and yes, the iconic pyramids. No aliens needed, just lots of sweaty people and supervisors making sure productivity metrics were met. Fast forward a bit, once waters receded, growing season began. Farmers plowed soil with simple wooden tools pulled by cattle, seeds scattered by hand, no modern machinery humming along, just humans, oxen, and blistered hands. Harvest season meant long days cutting barley and wheat with flint blades. It was tedious, dusty, and repetitive. But at least there was beer afterward. Let's talk about that beer. Egyptians loved beer. Not in the modern craft brew IPA infused with citrus scents. This was thick, bready liquid, more nutritious than refreshing. You didn't drink water straight from the Nile unless you wanted an ancient stomach bug, so fermented grain beverage was basically hydration insurance. If you picture an elegant scene with golden goblets and delicate sips, stop. These were clay jars and gulps, sometimes while standing in a field. Meals were predictable. Bread, beer, onions, leeks, fish from the river. Meat was rare unless you were wealthy or celebrating. Hunting was a thing, but most ordinary people didn't casually chase gazelles between shifts. Let's drift into family life. Households were usually smallish, though relatives could drift in when needed. Marriage happened young. Children were plentiful because infant mortality was high, and reliable birth control had not yet been invented, unless you count crocodile dung pessaries, which we will politely not elaborate on right now. Children grew up fast. They learned by doing. No formal schooling unless you were scribal material. Boys followed fathers into trades. Girls learned domestic work and weaving from their mothers. Childhood wasn't whimsical. You did chores early. If something needed carrying, you carried it. If clay needed kneading, congratulations, your small arms suddenly became factory equipment. Clothing kept things simple. Linen for everyone. Lightweight because the heat was relentless. Men in kilts, women in sheath dresses. Children often wore nothing at all until puberty. No shame, just practicality. Laundry bills non-existent. Let's glide over to social classes. They existed even here at the bottom of the hierarchy. Not all ordinary Egyptians were equal. Some were successful farmers owning small plots. Others were tenant workers on elite estates. Craftsmen could specialize: pottery, metalwork, carpentry, weaving. Skilled artisans carved tomb inscriptions or decorated temples. And scribes, the nerds of the Nile, were privileged. Literacy was rare. If you could write, you didn't toil in the sun. You sat indoors recording tax rolls, grain storage, and complaints. Yes, ancient paperwork existed. Work for women was both household and economic. They could own property, run businesses, hire workers. Ancient Egypt was surprisingly progressive for women's rights compared to later societies. Religion seeped into every part of life. Ordinary Egyptians worshipped household gods. Amulets hung around necks or placed inside clothes. A broken jar could be explained by spirits. A fever blamed on displeased deities. The afterlife was democratized slowly. At first, elaborate immortality was reserved for the elite. Over centuries, beliefs expanded. Common people could hope for a pleasant afterlife too, though without the deluxe mummy package. Burials were simple. Desert sand preserved bodies naturally. Wooden coffins were for those who could afford them. Funerary goods included pottery, bread, amulets, just the essentials. Imagine packing for eternity. Most packed light. Let's wander over to work rhythms. There were breaks, festivals, religious holidays, public celebrations. Not because productivity science encouraged rest, but because priests said so. And if the divine calendar declared a feast, who was going to argue? Music and dance filled these festivals. Harps, flutes, clappers, drums, nothing booming, just soft rhythms under open sky. Board games too, Senet being the most famous, a symbolic journey of souls, but probably also used for casual gambling. Someone likely cheated, even in 1500 BCE. Imagine lying on your roof at night. It's hot, mosquitoes buzzing, the Nile's quiet movement in the distance. Maybe a funeral procession torch glows dimly across the field. Dogs bark, a baby cries somewhere. There were moments of peace, but also anxiety. Flood levels determined life or death. Too little water meant famine. Too much erased homes. And the pharaoh, divine ruler, was held responsible for maintaining cosmic order. Not that common farmers regularly met the pharaoh. His decisions flowed downward through scribes, priests, and overseers until they became commands scribbled on papyrus. Taxation was collected in grain. Storage granaries kept surplus. These granaries also prevented total disaster during bad years, ideally, unless corrupt officials skimmed off the top, which historians suspect happened, frequently. Record-keeping was obsessive. Clay seals, papyrus scrolls, tally marks scratched onto pottery shards. Bureaucracy is eternal. Let's float toward gender roles again, because they were oddly flexible. Women could own property independently. Divorce was possible. Contracts were written. A woman could inherit wealth and manage estates. But that doesn't mean perfect equality. Gendered labor still dominated daily reality. Housework was relentless, with grinding grain being one of the most time-consuming tasks. A cornstone, kneeling for hours, pressing grain into flour, day after day. Still, Egyptian women had more rights than later Greek and Roman women. Not a high bar, but worth noting. Let's drift back outside. Animals lived close by. Donkeys for transport, goats and cattle for milk and meat. Cats kept rodents ore, dogs for hunting. Cats became sacred, dogs somewhat useful, donkeys tolerated. Clothing dyes existed but were limited. Natural pigments created muted colors. Embroidery signaled status. Jewelry too. Copper bracelets, faience beads, shell pendants. Nothing too extravagant for common folk, but still personal. Sometimes archaeologists find clay figurines, maybe toys, maybe fertility charms. We're not sure. Interpretations drift. The pace of life was cyclical, predictable. Seasons guided everything. Time felt steady. Yet disease lurked. Malaria, intestinal parasites, eye infections from desert dust, dental problems from sandy bread grit grinding enamel like sandpaper. Life expectancy was short. Many died before 40. Many infants never reached adulthood. But laughter existed. Love, too. Scribbles on pottery showed jokes, doodles, personal messages. People teased each other, complained about work, worried about family. Ordinary Egyptians weren't faceless laborers. They were people with frustrations, routines, and hopes. Not everything was eternal stone and divine glory. Mostly it was mud, sweat, and repeated tasks. So as we drift further into their world, we begin to understand something subtle. Civilization isn't built by rulers carving their names into stone. It's built by the anonymous hands that stacked the bricks, sowed the crops, and cooked the bread. Let's float gently into another dimension of their lives, labor obligations. Corvée labor required farmers to leave home during flood season. They traveled to work camps, perhaps weeks away. Families stayed behind. Supervisors monitored shifts with wooden tally sticks. Villages emptied. Work gangs built dikes to control the river, constructed monuments commissioned by pharaohs who needed to display power, because apparently controlling the universe wasn't enough. Workers lived in makeshift barracks, food rationed, beer measured out carefully. Archaeological remains showed designated bakeries near pyramids, industrial-scale bread production, rows of ovens, flour everywhere. Not artisanal micro-batches, just huge quantities to feed armies of workers. Let's slow down and consider writing. Literacy allowed upward mobility, rarely. A farmer's son becoming a scribe required patronage or sheer look. If accepted, he trained for years memorizing hieroglyphs, thousands of symbols, complex grammar. It wasn't a hobby, but the reward was indoor work and a social bump. Scribes documented everything, so we know ordinary Egyptians petitioned officials, complained about corrupt overseers, filed workplace grievances. Yes, workplace complaints existed 3,500 years ago. So next time your supervisor schedules a useless meeting, remember, humans have suffered bureaucracy since the dawn of civilization. The flow of life continued around agriculture. After harvest, grain stored in community silos, rats inevitable, cots celebrated. Surplus grain supported religion and bureaucracy. Priests redistributed resources. Temple estates functioned as economic hubs. Ordinary workers might repair temple roofs, clean courtyards, or carry offerings. Religion wasn't separate from economy. It ran parallel, intertwined. Food preparation dominated women's labor. Grinding grain, baking bread, brewing beer. These weren't occasional chores. They consumed hours daily. For cooking, pottery vessels rested on metal stands over open fires. Smoke clung to walls. Eyes stung. Ventilation limited. Evenings were quiet. No electricity, no glowing screens. Conversations whispered. Stories passed down through generations. Imagine lying under a blanket of stars. Desert air cooling slowly. Crickets chirping. The steady flow of the Nile like a heartbeat. A distant chant from a temple ritual. A drumbeat echoing faintly. Somewhere a scribe sharpened his reed pen. Somewhere a farmer sharpened his sickle. Life drifted between duty and divine cycles. And so the ordinary people lived mostly unseen by history. Their names lost, their voices silent. but their presence unmistakable. Without them, no monuments would stand, no temples would rise, no pharaoh would be remembered. If you're still awake, that's either impressive or you've reached that strange half-dream state where the words turn into soft background mush. Perfect. Let's keep floating through these ancient lives like a slow barge on the Nile at dusk. We're still among the ordinary Egyptians, the people whose hands made history but whose names dissolved into sand. This time, we follow their day not from a distant aerial view, but up close, like we're walking slowly through a village, barefoot, sand between our toes, trying not to trip over someone's goose. Because yes, geese were everywhere, loud, territorial, and probably the original alarm system. Picture the sun rising over the horizon, not gentle, more like dawn explodes across the sky, turning sand into blinding gold. Most people were awake long before sunrise anyway. Egypt worked on a solar schedule. When the light came, you worked. When the darkness returned, you slept. Except during festivals. We'll get to that soon. A farmer's morning routine was predictable. First, check livestock. Water them, feed them. Make sure a neighbor hasn't borrowed something temporarily again. Tools had a habit of migrating across property lines without paperwork. Next, check irrigation channels, water levels, silt accumulation. No modern alarms, no weather app notifications. Only instincts and experience passed down from ancestors who'd stared at the same river and worried about the same uncertainties. Work began early. Tools carried across the field. Plows were simple wooden structures, sometimes fitted with bronze blades, though bronze was expensive. Most used stone blades or went without. Oxen provided muscle, moving steadily at a pace that made sloths look ambitious. Weeding followed, bending low, hands in soil, sun climbing higher. You might think ancient people were constantly grateful for divine blessings. In reality, they probably muttered ancient Egyptian equivalents of, "Why am I doing this again?" Hunger hit early. Breakfast was small. Bread, beer, maybe leftover fish. Bread wasn't bakery fluffy. It was coarse and gritty from wind-blown sand that found its way into every stage of production. Imagine chewing bread that doubles as dental exfoliation. Dental records from mummies tell us enamel wore down fast. Abscesses common, tooth pain chronic, but complaining likely didn't help unless someone offered an herbal poultice or magical incantation. Because medicine for ordinary people was part practical remedy and part spiritual negotiation. If your head hurt, a physician might prescribe herbs, or recite a spell invoking a healing god, or both. Religion wasn't separate from science, it was the scaffolding of reality. The Nile didn't flood on schedule because of hydraulics. It flooded because the gods maintained cosmic order. So you worked to survive, but also to ensure divine balance. Let's wander to a workshop. Not every Egyptian farmed. Specialized crafts thrived. Potters shaped vessels on slow wheels, smoothing wet clay with steady hands. Their kilns burned hot, turning fragile forms into hardened tools for cooking, storing, or transporting grain and beer. Some workshops specialized in fans, an artificial ceramic resembling turquoise, tiny beads, amulets, rings, affordable splashes of color for ordinary people. Others carved wood, doors, furniture, ship components, tools. Carpenters faced wood scarcity. Egypt locked forests. Timber imported from Lebanon or Nubia if needed, so craftsmen learned to stretch resources creatively. Leather workers tanned hides for sandals and belts. Weavers spun linen thread from flax fibers. Looms stood upright, requiring long hours of repetitive motion. If you've ever folded laundry for too long, imagine that sensation multiplied by 10,000 threads. It gives weaving a meditative quality or a repetitive strain injury. Children helped in workshops. Apprenticeship was practical. No schools teaching theory. You learned by watching and doing. The hum of labor filled the market district. Voices low, tools tapping, pots clinking. dust rising. Around midday, the sun's intensity became aggressive. Shade was sacred. Work slowed, people paused, ate small meals, then returned to tasks. Work never truly ended. Evenings brought domestic responsibilities, grinding, dough kneading, cooking over open fires, brewing, cleaning, animal care. No weekends, no scheduled breaks, no vacations to coastal resorts, just cycles, predictable, heavy, and necessary. Let's drift inside a home. A mudbrick structure, thick walls, flat roof, simple door. One room for living, another for storage, sometimes a courtyard. No fancy furniture, a stool here, a woven mat there, clay jars leaning against walls. Inside, smoke lingered from cooking fires. If the family had chickens, they weren't fenced. They wandered freely, clucking indignantly, probably unaware of their culinary future. Domestic pets existed. Cats hunted rodents, dogs guarded property. Monkeys occasionally kept as exotic companions by wealthier households. Ordinary people admired them from a distance, aware that monkeys cause chaos. Domestic tasks were constant. Grinding grain with a saddle quern required 2 hands and a lot of stamina. Leaning forward, rocking motion, crushing grain into flour. Hours per day. No gym memberships needed. Life was full-body labor. Meals prepared carefully. Fire managing required skill. Too hot, food burned. Too little heat, undercooked grain tasted like misery. Clay pots blackened from soot. Bread baked on heated stones. Dinner wasn't an event, just fuel. Families ate together, sometimes sharing dishes. Tools basic, wooden spoons, fingers common, courtesy optional depending on hunger levels. After dinner, cleanup minimal, no dishwashers, water precious. Evenings quiet. Women spun thread or repaired garments. Men repaired tools. Children played. No screens, no artificial light beyond oil lamps. Just the fading sun, the dull glow of embers. Conversations slow. Stories retold. Gossip whispered. Who owed grain to whom? Which priest seemed too well fed? Which overseer suspiciously avoided labor? Human nature unchanged. Let's float into festivals. Because life wasn't all labor, Egyptians valued celebration. Religious festivals punctuated the year. Temples prepared rituals. Musicians played harps, lutes, and drums. Dancers performed. Priests carried statues of gods through streets. Ordinary people followed processions, cheered softly, sang hymns. Offerings brought bread, beer, fruits. During festivals, work paused. People drank, not excessively chaotic, just mildly relaxed. Beer flowed freely. Conversations loosened, a momentary break from routine. Festivals reinforced social unity, reminded everyone that even though some worked in fields and others guarded temple granaries, all relied on the same gods. Night wrapped around villages quickly. The desert cooled, air stilled. Families retreated indoors or to rooftops, sleeping on roofs common during hot months, the sky wide, stars bright. Imagine lying there, staring upward, listening to the river's distant murmur, insects buzzing. No clock ticking, no traffic humming, just breath, warmth, and quiet anticipation of tomorrow's tasks, because tomorrow was nearly identical to today. Egyptian daily life wasn't dramatic. It wasn't full of cliffhangers or battles. It was slow, repetitive, built around survival and ritual. But monotony brings stability, and stability builds civilization. Pharaohs claimed divine power, but farmers fed the nation. Workers raised monuments and infrastructure. Scribes recorded every grain payment. A complex system supported by ordinary hands. Most of these people never traveled far. Life contained within village boundaries. Temple trips occasional. Yet their world felt complete. The Nile provided context, rhythm, and meaning. And though they didn't appear in royal inscriptions, their bodies, tools, and grain stores kept Egypt functioning. If your eyes feel heavy, that's intentional. This is the kind of history that gently blurs into a night dream of grain silos and slow-moving oxen. Let's keep drifting downstream through the everyday currents of ancient Egyptian life. We've walked through fields, peeked into workshops, and shared evening bread under a fading desert sky. Now we float towards subtler currents: social mobility, authority, money, or the Egyptian version of it, marriages, neighbor drama, and the invisible rules maintaining order long before written law codes tried to tidy up human chaos. Let's start with hierarchy. Egypt is often remembered as a pyramid-shaped society, and not just architecturally. The social pyramid placed the pharaoh at the top, shimmering in divine radiance. Beneath him, nobles and priests. Beneath them, scribes and administrators. And way down, beneath several dusty layers, were the ordinary people. But this pyramid model oversimplifies reality. Human lives rarely fit into neat diagrams. In truth, the lower tiers had subtle gradients. A small landholding farmer wasn't the same as a landless laborer. A successful potter with contracts to temple workshops lived differently from a tenant scraping grain for estate owners. A scribe's cousin might enjoy minor privileges simply through proximity to literacy. Mobility existed, but very slowly. Think continental drift, but with papyrus paperwork. A farmer could become a scribe if granted patronage, trained and accepted. A craftsman could accumulate wealth and pass it to children. But upward movement required luck, talent, and endurance. More often, mobility flowed sideways: marriages aligning households, debt reshuffling property, inheritance changing who owned the livestock. A village could stay socially stable for generations, each family holding familiar roles like actors in a script performed over centuries. Let's talk property. We may imagine ordinary Egyptians living communally, but property ownership mattered deeply. Land measured wealth and autonomy. But land wasn't owned outright by most people. Much of it belonged to the king, temples, and elite estates. Common farmers leased plots, paying rents in grain or forced labor. This basically made the Nile Valley one long landlord-tenant relationship that stretched across dynasties. Because no matter the century, there's always someone collecting rent. Property disputes existed. Boundary markers moved mysteriously overnight. A flood destroyed irrigation channels. A neighbor built slightly too close. Arguments could escalate into formal complaints. The papyri that survive show petitions from villagers requesting justice, usually politely, though you can detect simmering frustration behind the flowery language. Imagine the ancient Egyptian equivalent of customer support emails, but written in hieratic script on reed paper. Now, marriage. Ordinary marriages rarely involved elaborate ceremonies. A couple agreed, families approved, and they simply began living together. Sometimes contracts recorded dowry, property rights, or responsibilities, especially later in Egyptian history when legal documentation became more common. Marriage wasn't exclusively romantic. Practical considerations dominated. Who could grind grain? Who could inherit land? Who could produce children to support labor needs? Yet affection did exist. Letters to spouses show tenderness, longing, and jealousy. Human emotion doesn't obey time periods. Divorce was possible, though not common. A woman could initiate divorce and retain property depending on agreements. Rights varied across era and status. Children strengthened household continuity. They inherited wealth but also debts. So a father dying young could doom his family economically until adulthood when sons could work full labor. Inheritance rules prioritized sons, but daughters could inherit if sons absent. Women could manage estates and hire workers. So in practice, ordinary life resembled a constant negotiation between tradition, economic survival, and divine expectation. Let's drift into labor camps again. We tend to picture pyramids rising through collective awe and architectural genius, but for many workers it was seasonal employment, mandatory, unpaid, or paid in rations. Laborers lived in temporary barracks built near major construction zones. Archaeological remains show standardized housing blocks, communal kitchens, bakeries, and medical facilities. Evidence suggests nutrition quality was higher in camps than in villages. You needed strong bodies to move stone. Overseers enforced quotas. Foremen organized work gangs into rotating shifts. Each block hauled limestone along sledges lubricated with water or oil. Some workers carved stone inside workshops to produce casing blocks. We don't need to dramatize suffering. Monumental labor was exhausting, yes, but workers received rations, lodging, and some security. They weren't enslaved, at least during Old Kingdom pyramid construction. Most were citizens fulfilling duty, seasonal workers, or hired specialists. Slavery did exist in Egypt, but it was complex, varied across centuries, and didn't form the primary labor force for pyramids. History is never as tidy as textbooks imply. Let's slow down into the rhythm of economic exchange. Money did not exist in metallic coin form until much later. Instead, goods formed currency: barley, wheat, beer, oil, cloth, livestock. A day's labor payment measured in grain units. Prices recorded in lists. 1 goat equals so many jars of barley. Temple scribes logged taxes and storage deposits carefully. Receipts literally written on pottery shards, ostraca, because papyrus was expensive. These fragments reveal everyday life more clearly than royal monuments ever could. One shard records rations for a work gang. Another documents grain owed by a tenant. Another shows a note reminding someone to deliver firewood. Through these scraps, ordinary voices echo. Now imagine a village dispute. Someone accuses a neighbor of stealing tools. Another demands repayment of lent grain. Boundary markers shifted after flood season. Instead of police, elders and scribes mediated. They listened, recorded testimony, and reached compromise. Justice depended on local relationships and social reputation as much as law. And like every society, gossip enforced order more effectively than decrees. If your neighbor heard you refused to repay grain, good luck borrowing bread next famine. Let's drift toward hygiene and appearance. Daily bathing wasn't a luxury. It was necessary in a hot climate. Egyptians washed using water jars and natron-based soaps. Women applied scented oils. Cosmetics, not vain indulgence, protection from sun and insects. Coal-lined eyes to reduce glare. Shaved heads common among workers. Wigs worn occasionally. Children shaved with a sidelock of youth left dangling, a cultural identifier. Ornamentation simple for ordinary people. Faience beads, copper bracelets, shell pendants. Piercings existed, tattoos existed, though meanings varied. Cleanliness intersected with religious purity. Because in Egypt, physical and spiritual realms mirrored one another gently. Let's examine quiet anxieties. Ordinary Egyptians depended on forces beyond control: the flooding Nile, crop pests, disease, taxation, conscription. Fear of drought loomed constantly. Greeneries offered protection, but corrupt officials could siphon supplies. Documents reveal food shortages sparked petitions. Famine didn't always mean mass death. Often it meant slow hunger, weakened bodies, increased vulnerability to illness. Children bore the brunt. Infant mortality rates high. Parents mourned quietly, accepting loss as part of the cycle. Small clay figurines in graves suggest emotional attachments, not just ritual placeholders, but tokens of memory. Life felt precarious, yet grounded in tradition and community resilience. Now let's follow a young boy apprenticing in a scribe household. Parents hope for upward mobility, competition fierce. He wakes early, copies symbols onto ostraca. Mistakes corrected harshly. Lessons repetitive. But if he succeeds, he'll escape field labor. He'll document brine storage, record marriage contracts, tally rations, or receive petitions. He becomes part of the bureaucratic machinery that upheld the state. Without scribes, nothing flowed. Taxes? Impossible. Labor assignments? Lost. Temple offerings? Mismanaged. Scribes weren't glamorous, but essential, and they knew it. Some scribal texts criticize manual labor and praise literacy. A slight class superiority conveyed quietly through proverbs like, "A scribe's pen is mightier than the plow." Not dramatic, just workplace flexing in hieroglyphs. Let's return to households. Marriage, not just about children, but economic cooperation. A wife managed household supplies, weaving, green storage. Husband managed field labor or craft. Together, they navigated taxation obligations and religious duties. Women brewed beer, baked bread, tended animals, spun thread. Men repaired tools, irrigated fields, built structures. Tasks blended when necessary. Survival demanded flexibility. Households passed skills across generations. No resumes, no job interviews, just continuity. Imagine evenings, a quiet courtyard, a clay lamp flickering, insects humming. A woman kneads dough for next morning's bread. A boy practices writing in dust with a stick. A father sharpens a knife used for harvesting reeds. They speak softly about the coming flood. Will water levels be high enough? Will taxes increase? Will temple officials demand grain contributions? Their worries mundane, yet immense. The same uneasy feeling you get checking bank balances or grocery prices, but tied to the literal survival of crops. Festivals offered relief. Crowds decorated by dim torchlight. Priests carried sacred statues along procession routes. Chants drifted across fields. Offerings piled before temple gates. For ordinary villagers, seeing the god statue emerge from the inner sanctuary was rare, awe-tinged, but familiar. Before returning indoors, families watched stars reflected faintly in irrigation basins. The sky steady, the river steady, life steady, until the next flood changed boundaries, debts, or harvest yields. At night, stories passed orally, tales of gods battling chaos, animal fables teaching moral lessons, legends about ancestors who prospered or lost everything, laughter low and tired, voices drifting softly into the dark. Word of mouth preserved cultural continuity more effectively than monumental inscriptions, because ordinary memory outlives stone through repetition and familial ritual. Let's close this part with a gentle truth. The lives of ordinary Egyptians weren't defined by exotic mysteries or epic drama. Mostly, they followed predictable rhythms, patterns repeated across generations. Work, worry, worship, family, rest. Small joys punctuated routine. A child's birth, a successful harvest, a quiet night breeze. These people didn't live in the shadow of pyramids so much as beneath their weight, materially and symbolically. Yet they carried the civilization quietly, brick by brick, seed by seed, line by line on papyrus. And in the slow unfolding of days beneath an ancient sun, they sustained an empire history remembers through kings, but built through hands like theirs. If you're listening while drifting off, go ahead and adjust your blanket, flatten the pillow a bit, and let your eyes soften. Tonight, we're wandering back in time again. Not to pyramids this time, not to medieval moats or powdered wigs. No, tonight we're taking a slow walk along a very, very, very long stretch of stone and packed earth. And as always with imperial architecture, someone suffered for it, usually peasants. So let's begin our sleepy slide into the past, to ancient China, and explore the world surrounding what eventually became the Great Wall. We're not focusing on emperors screaming orders from palaces, although they will inevitably appear because that's what emperors do. Instead, we'll hover at the edges, drifting over the chilly northern frontier, watching the lonely laborers who carved stone with hands already cracked from the cold. the villagers forced to pack earth until their shoulders felt like threads, the soldiers stationed far away from home because someone at court couldn't sleep unless there were 12 fortifications between him and nomadic horsemen. This wall wasn't built in one weekend project. There was no imperial DIY video. This was centuries of quiet misery stacked layer by layer. So let's curl up next to a crackling imaginary fire, trace the drifting desert winds, and follow the ordinary people whose lives unfolded in the shadow of the Great Wall. Just breathe slow. We're going to take our time. The earliest walls sprouted long before anything resembling the iconic stone battlements people picture today. Historians trace the first defensive walls back to the Warring States period, around the 7th to 3rd centuries BCE. China then wasn't unified. It was more like a group of siblings sharing one house, constantly plotting who gets the good bedroom. And by bedroom, I mean territory, taxes, and military power. States like Qin, Zhao, Yan, all building their own stretches of earth rammed into long ridges across the frontier, because nomadic tribes rode horses like they were part of them, slipping in and out of borders, raiding villages whose walls consisted of air. So the rulers did what rulers often do. Instead of addressing the root causes of conflict, they built walls and soldiers and taxes. But let's drift away from state-level anxiety for a moment. Imagine a young peasant named something very typical. We'll call him Li because there were probably 10 dozen Lis in every village. Li doesn't particularly care which state is yelling about sovereignty. He wakes up before sunrise, rubs frost from his woven bedding, and walks out into the cold morning. He stretches, then notices the messenger riding through the dusty road again. Draft orders are being posted. Labor for state construction. Translation: Li's winter plans of trying to survive peacefully are canceled. He will be marching to join tens of thousands of other conscripted workers stacking earth for the newest wall extension. No paycheck, just state duty. And if he refuses, there's punishment. Or worse, that tends to motivate compliance. This is where the idea of ordinary life around the Great Wall begins to look less postcard beautiful and more like a slow endurance test. The construction technique used early on was rammed earth, layers packed between wooden boards, pressed until dense. It sounds simple, but imagine doing that for months. Feet stamping, hands hauling, shoulder muscles trembling, repetitive motion from dawn to dusk. Some workers were criminals sentenced to labor, some soldiers, many just peasants like Li caught in the gears of state necessity. And while the elite argued philosophy and wrote poetry about order and harmony, these people fed frost-bitten fingers into the empire machine. But surprisingly, complaints were mostly whispered, because whispering keeps you alive. There were songs, though. Quiet work songs muttered under breath. They probably weren't cheerful like modern musical productions, more like rhythmic sighs keeping time with the striking of earth tampers. Tap, breath, tap, breath. The wall wasn't one smooth construction. One emperor would build a section, a later ruler would let it crumble, another would reinforce it if northern threats grew again. Like a national anxiety project that came and went over centuries depending on foreign policy mood swings. But the ordinary people around it, their experience was more constant. Life on the northern frontier meant preparing for raids or hearing rumors of soldiers stationed far away. A mother grinding millet in her courtyard could glance toward the horizon and wonder silently if her oldest son would ever return. Travelers heading toward the frontier would carry news from villages. So-and-so's husband died on the worksite. This batch of workers fainted in the desert heat. Soldiers froze in their watchtowers last winter. Rumors spread calmly, like cracks spreading through dry earth. No outrage, just tired acceptance, because they couldn't change it. Let's float gently now to the Qin dynasty around 221 BCE. Qin Shi Huang unified the warring states into one empire, declaring himself the first emperor. Modest guy. A simple title like king wasn't enough. With unity came the impulse to secure borders, and if you have several existing walls already, why not link them, like assembling mismatched furniture pieces from different eras and calling it a set. The Great Wall began to resemble something continuous, miles and miles of earth barriers stretching across mountains, deserts, and open plains. Construction intensified. Workers died at staggering rates. Corpses buried near the foundations because transporting them home would be too costly and inefficient. The phrase, the longest cemetery on earth, isn't entirely metaphorical. But again, don't picture screaming chaos. For a sleepy perspective, imagine the numb monotony of it. Workers marching silently, tools scraping, feet dragging through sand. One step, one breath, one layer of tamped earth. Lee, or someone just like him, would fall into a trance of exhaustion, days blurring, seasons slipping by, his world shrinking to the rhythm of labor. There's something unsettlingly peaceful about repetition. You forget time has meaning. Of course, modern tourists look at the stone battlements and dramatic mountain ridges and ignore centuries of invisible earth beneath. The famous brick sections mostly come from the Ming Dynasty, around the 14th to 16th centuries CE. Between Qin and Ming, there were periods of neglect. Nomadic tribes overran frontier defenses. Dynasties rose and collapsed. But through everything, ordinary people kept farming, kept raising goats, kept repairing houses when weather tore roofs off. Life near the frontier was harsh not just because of war threats, but because the environment wasn't kind. Winters could freeze breath mid-air. Summers scorched crops. Wind carried sand into everything. A soldier stationed on a remote pass might sit in a watchtower squinting into the distance for hours. His waterskins would freeze overnight. Wolves howling far below would echo through the valley. He wasn't defending glory. He was following orders, sending signals back to base if riders appeared. At night, he'd warm what little wine he could get, stare up at the bleeding stars, and think of home. Wonder if his family even remembered his face. Meanwhile, back in a village nestled near the frontier, mothers would check doors twice, slide wood beams into place, and sleep lightly. They trusted in the wall partly, but also knew walls don't stop hunger, poverty, or politics. Maybe a traveling merchant passed through, selling cheap iron tools and gossip. He'd talk about new fortifications, new troop movements. He'd whisper complaints about taxes being raised, again, supposedly to fund repairs. The villagers wouldn't be surprised. Taxes were as predictable as sunrise. As centuries drifted, each dynasty left its fingerprints along the wall. Design changes, added guard towers, improved signaling systems like smoke and fire. But workers remained anonymous. Ordinary people, farmers, soldiers, laborers, artisans, built the wall, patrolled it, lived beneath its shadow, and died beneath it. Life wasn't dramatic. It was repetitive, quiet, filled with slow compromises. Even marriages along the frontier were shaped by the wall. Soldiers stationed permanently would start families in remote posts, forming communities that existed solely because imperial paranoia needed bodies on the border. Let's drift again to a cold morning in the Ming period. Snow crunches beneath boots. A long line of men carry bricks up a steep slope. Their breaths rise in ghosts of vapor. There's no cheering, no military anthem, just begrudging cooperation and silent endurance. This time, the walls are stone, brick, reinforced with watchtowers. Mongol pressures had heightened border urgency. When bureaucrats fear nomadic raids, construction budgets magically expand. A soldier on night watch might top a suspended metal pan to signal patrol rhythm, not out of alertness, but boredom, a metallic heartbeat echoing through the frozen air. In a nearby hut, an old woman mending worn shoes hears the faint ringing and sighs. Another winter under the empire's gaze, another season hoping her grandson returns. The wall looms constant through her memories. She remembers being a child when new conscription orders arrived, when her father packed his bundle and walked away to join labor brigades. He never came back. People didn't document these quiet tragedies. Historians recorded edicts, troop movements, expenditure reports, but not the personal losses scattered like grains of sand across the frontier. Ordinary life meant adapting, growing millet despite droughts, bargaining with traveling traders, repairing cracked pottery, quietly resenting distant officials but never loudly enough for consequences. Living beside the Great Wall was like living with a stern stone parent looming on the mountains, always watching, always present, not comforting exactly, just imposing. We picture the wall as an impenetrable barrier, but ancient soldiers knew better. It slowed invaders but didn't stop determined armies. Gaps existed, corruption existed, guards accepted bribes. In peaceful years, frontier regions even traded with steppe nomads despite official prohibition, because survival trumps policy. Ordinary families needed wool, needed horses, needed things imperial supply chains couldn't provide reliably. So while officials wrote reports about military discipline, villagers quietly bartered dried grain for furs. Life went on in the shadow of the wall, indifferent to grand strategy. The wall was supposed to symbolize strength, stability, civilization resisting chaos. But to the people beneath it, the symbolism was simpler: mandatory labor, higher taxes, and a constant reminder that power flows one direction, from palace to village, never reversed. Even so, some workers took pride in construction. Humans find meaning where they can. Imagine Lee, older now, running his fingertips across the earthen wall he helped build decades earlier, hardened ridges beneath his fingers. Maybe he whispered to younger workers, "I built that section when I was your age." A small claim of immortality, something to soften the memory of forced labor. Because even suffering becomes normalized with time. The Great Wall became part of the land itself, a spine across mountains. People built houses near it using leftover stones. Children played at its base, weaving games between crumbling battlements. The wall shaped the rhythm of their world the way a river shapes a valley, slowly, silently. Now let's pause, breathe, and let the wind settle in your imagination. In the next part, we'll keep gliding through history. We'll drift closer to individual lives, soldiers, families, wandering traders, whose existence intertwined with this massive structure across centuries. Not dramatic battles, but the quiet, personal routines the wall imposed. If you're still awake, impressive. If you're drifting, that's fine too. This is, after all, the gentle, monotone saga of people living beside a wall that just kept going. Like that one friend who texts too often, but you don't know how to stop them. So let's stretch out again, loosen the jaw, and return to the northern frontier, where the Great Wall runs like a scar across the land. Not the tourist-friendly stone staircases and glossy handrails. No, picture lonely watchtowers rising out of empty plains, winter frost clinging to every crack, the faint whistle of wind slipping through battlements like a thief checking for unlocked doors. By the Ming Dynasty, the wall was no longer just a building project. It was a system, a lifestyle, a psychological boundary between us and them, even though them often traded, intermarried, and chatted casually with us when officials weren't peeking. Let's wander toward one of the garrisons. Nothing dramatic, just a sleepy peek at how soldiers lived. A typical frontier garrison wasn't glamorous. Sorry to anyone picturing gleaming armor and epic formations. Honestly, the most thrilling thing soldiers saw on a Tuesday was probably soup with slightly larger radish chunks. Imagine a soldier named Bao. He didn't ask to be stationed here, but someone at headquarters rolled a dice of destiny, and here he is, shivering in a tower far from any city worth mentioning. His daily routine: wake up to the sound of wind battering wooden shutters. Check the brazier to see if embers survived the night. Pull on stiff boots that never fully dry. Walk the wall path for inspection. His boots crunch frost. His breath fogs. He watches another bored soldier poke at a frozen puddle with the tip of his spear, as if testing whether water has magically changed properties since yesterday. The commander strolls by, pretending everything is under control, even though supply deliveries are late again. When supplies do arrive, they come in long caravans, grain sacks slung over oxen, creaking carts leaving deep grooves in frozen mud. And as always, rumors ride in alongside the grain. Some arriving officer inevitably tells the garrison, "We may be reinforcing this post soon," which everyone translates as, "Someone in the capital panicked after hearing a rumor about northern tribes again." But reinforcement rarely comes. It's cheaper to pretend walls hold back history than actually maintain them. Let's drift downhill to the civilian settlement below. Walls don't stand in total isolation. They attract support villages like barnacles on a ship. Someone has to mend boots, feed the army, sharpen tools. Grandmothers bargain over millet. Grandfathers repair fences. Chickens wander the alleys with more freedom than soldiers. A potter named Wen shapes clay bowls with hands permanently cracked. She listens to soldiers complain about rations, and young wives whisper about husbands stationed somewhere far beyond the mountains. Taxes bite hard here. Money flows one direction, toward the bureaucracy. If officials showed up to audit grain stores, villagers put on polite smiles while mentally calculating how much food would disappear into official pockets. Corruption wasn't shocking. It was routine, like weather forecasts. One villager might shrug and say, "At least this year they only took half." That's considered optimistic frontier philosophy. Trade along the wall deserves a sleepy detour. Authorities tried to control interaction with nomadic groups, but economics doesn't listen to bureaucratic anxiety. Ordinary people traded quietly because wool cloaks keep you warmer than patriotic slogans. So picture a winter night. A small campfire flickers in a hidden ravine. A local farmer meets two horsemen draped in fur. No dramatic tension, just tired bargaining. Grain for hides, dried bean cakes for sturdy horsehair rope. Footsteps crunch snow. Everyone glances around. Not out of fear exactly, just the instinct to avoid paperwork and punishment. After a brief exchange, the horsemen vanish into the dark, hooves disappearing into snow like ink dissolving into water. The farmer carries his goods home, careful not to drop a grain. He knows the next cold snap could kill a goat or ruin a harvest. Every tiny thread of trade matters. The wall tries to separate people, but life weaves them together anyway, quietly. Let's float to another scene. A young woman named Lon wakes before dawn because chopping vegetables for soldiers pays slightly better than farm work. Slightly. She ties her outer robe, steps outside, and feels the wind knife across her cheeks. She doesn't think grand thoughts about imperial defense. She thinks about firewood shortages, cracked water jars, and whether her cousin will survive conscription this year. She arrives at the army kitchen. The cook yawns without opening his eyes fully. He's been here 20 years and no longer remembers cities with paved roads. They slice radishes, stir rice, occasionally scrape mold from storage jars. No one tells the capital that garrisons survive because cooks quietly ignore ration rules and stretch food through creative substitutions. Soup simmers. A bell rings. Soldiers file in, half asleep, bowls in hand. Conversations are quiet, mostly complaints about boots. No one talks about glory. Glory requires energy. We drift again, forward in time, but the scene hardly changes. Different dynasty, same wind, same taxes, same quiet endurance. Walls create routines. Routines shape identities. Children growing up near the wall internalize its presence the way city kids internalize street noise. It becomes background. A small boy runs along the wall path pretending to be a heroic general, completely unaware that his grandfather died hauling bricks for the same structure. Memory shortens intentionally. it's easier. Let's listen to the wall itself for a moment. Stone settles, earth shifts, snow melts into cracks. The wall slowly erodes, but never quickly enough to give anyone hope of escape from duty. Officials send repair orders. More laborers arrive. Generations blur. No grand celebrations mark completion phases. Construction is never complete anyway. It's like trimming hair that keeps regrowing. Imperial ambition never truly ends. Sometimes foreign envoys visit the garrison, and villagers gather discreetly to watch. Officials straighten postures. Armor gets polished. Drums sound, not for war, but for PR. A soldier who normally naps during watch duty stands extra straight for an hour, then slumps back once the envoy disappears over the ridge. Life resumes its usual quiet. Let's hover near a funeral procession. Nothing dramatic, just a slow trail moving along the dusty road. A laborer collapsed from exhaustion at the construction site. His family can't afford elaborate burial. They wrap the body in hemp cloth, return home without tears, grief expressed inwardly. A local elder mutters, "The wall takes another." Not bitter, just resigned. Then people return to work. Night settles. A pale moon hangs above the battlements. Lan finishes cleaning the kitchen and steps outside. She walks home along the wall shadows. Her breath forms tiny clouds. Her shoes crunch the packed snow. Above her, soldiers pace the parapets. Inside one watchtower, Bao sits beside a brazier, warming numb fingers. He writes a letter home with slow, deliberate strokes. He knows the letter might never travel far. Couriers vanish. Officials misplace mail. But writing is a quiet resistance to forgetting. He writes about wind patterns because what else is there? He writes about soup flavor variation. He writes that the moon looks the same everywhere, though he can't confirm it. At the end, he hesitates before adding, "I am well," even though his cracked hands say otherwise. But that's what letters are for, smoothing rough edges so families can sleep at night. Far from this lonely pass, in a warm palace hall, officials review border reports and discuss reinforcement strategy. They scribble notes about troop levels and supply inventories, unaware that the numbers are only partly accurate. They debate whether a particular watchtower should be rebuilt now or postponed. They never imagined Lan chopping vegetables in the cold morning, or Bao writing quiet letters, or an old woman mending shoes by candlelight. The wall means one thing to the capital: security. To the frontier, fatigue. Yet neither side speaks the same language emotionally. Let the wind sweep lightly through this memoryscape. Stone against sky, shadow against snow. Generations living beneath imperial anxiety, performing quiet routines that sustain the wall far more than bricks ever did. If you're still awake, maybe notice your own breathing. Slow, even. In the next part, we'll float deeper into later centuries, exploring how everyday communities evolved, even after the wall had technically failed at its military purpose. Walls outlive intentions. Dreamers drift, but stone persists.